university. So I have actually asked some assistance. I'm using their facility. So if we do start, and there might be a little bit of a hiccup with regard to the presentation, I want you just to bear with me because everything will be sorted out. You know, when you use your own facilities, it's fine. But when you sometimes use other people's facilities, you are not always so afraid. Okay. Okay. Good. Just
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Today, the session is by Mr.Sedick Crombie, author of the book My Apartheid Diary. It is about lives forgotten that need to be remembered. In one of the interviews, the author has stated this about this text. Mr. Sedick Crombie was a full-time and part-time student at the University of Western Cape. His academic qualification includes a bachelor's degree in industrial psychology and sociology, a teacher's diploma, and master's in public administration. In 1987, he took up a teaching position at Strand, and in 1998, he started a conflict resolution and mediating practice with a business partner and traveled across Africa. So recently, he has worked for the Provincial Education Department in training school governing bodies and staff. Mr. Crombie is a man of action, unlike many other writers who are impactful only with their writing. He is in the line of fire, and in the field, he has resolved a conflict between groups of fishermen and the taxi owners. So we are proud to have such an eminent personality with us today. So it's time for us to listen to the great and powerful Mr. Sedick Crombie. Sir, the floor is yours. You can address the audience.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I hope I will vindicate the confidence that you have in me. And thank you for affording me this platform in speaking to you. I will try now to just load my presentation. If you can just bear with me for a minute or two, and I'll see if I can just draw the presentation for you. Okay. Net oor Khalid kry vir die presentation as in Khalid Kara's presentation. Check net for the presentation. If you can just bear with me for a second. I have actually indicated that I am using the local university's facilities. So when you use other people's facilities, then obviously you sometimes have a little bit of a challenge. But if you could just bear with me, I think I should be able to have it now. I just need the presentation quickly. How's it? Could you just assist me quickly? Okay. I think mark it. It's open. That one. Okay. Yeah.
So as jy net op die slide staan. En dan gaan jy terug. As jy nou die is drie. Ek kan ook sien, as jy sien. Nee, detail nie. Ek gaan kyk in die screen sien. So 3 dots of loss. Ja, gewoonlik is dit so 'n puntjie wat net sê jy share dan sê jy screen dan gaan jy terug na jou screen toe dan kom op. Maar as jy nog op present, dan sien jy daai screen uit. So daar toe. Alhoewel word jy nie dan nie. Hoe kan mens altyd sien dat jy maar die komitee. Jy kan nie meer hoor of hulle dit is nou in range. What is the range? Slideshow. Wat kan ek sien ja? Sien jy? Ja. Waarom jy hulle kan sien al die makers as jy wil kyk hoe die mense lekker gaan in die daar. En dan dis jy wat hulle nou hoor te sien. Ja. Kan ek hoor dit op die beeld is. En dan gaan jy net in slide view dan gooi ons dan.
I just need to get an indication if everybody is seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, all right. She's not seeing. Right now, there, right. Are you seeing the presentation now? Are we seeing the presentation now? Okay. 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 Once again, good morning to everybody, and sorry for the little bit of delay. I want to once again take the opportunity of thanking you for affording me the platform to do, and I hope that I will vindicate your confidence which you have exposed. South Africa is a country, a blessed country. It's a country that is blessed with natural resources. It's a country that is blessed with human resources. It's a country that has a number of beautiful scenic drives. It's a country that has a lot of agricultural and fertile land. It's a country with minerals. It's a country that has flora and fauna that are not found anywhere else in the world. From the landscapes of the East Coast to the vegetation, the forest of the northeast part of South Africa. It is, however, a country which has a history, which has a past, which is not so good, which is not something that can be forgotten. It's a country which one finds has a lot that needs to be told, one that is not being fully conveyed. It is a country that is haunted by a past that still impacts and have left a legacy. So why am I now going back into history to tell you about South Africa? Because I believe there's a number of untold stories of South Africa that has not actually been put into the public domain. And it is important to talk about history. For Martin Luther King said, "We are not makers of history. We are made by history." We are made by history that is telling us that is being influenced by a number of factors and influences. We can even go further and even look at, well, what Malcolm X or Malik al-Sabah said. A person without a history is like somebody without a memory, and which makes it to be of the lower classes of creation. To forget your history is to forget your past. That will obviously influence your present and will be influencing your future as well. So that's why it's important for me today to convey to you the full context of South Africa's history. And in my writing, I have touched on some of the most critical components of South Africa's history. South Africa's history started many times or many decades from the inception of the birth of humanity. That's why South Africa is sometimes called the cradle of humanity. So we won't dwell into that part of the history, but we will start with the history of South Africa and look at South Africa before 1994. This is our country, South Africa, a country with beautiful landscape, as I've iterated earlier on. It's a country that was eventually made up of 4 provinces. And you will see in the map, which I depict here on the screen, that the Cape Province is the one province that has been at the forefront of South Africa's history. Why the Cape Province? The Cape Province was the halfway station to the Far East and to the Middle East. And when the Europeans ventured, when they wanted to conquer new lands on their way to the spice route in India and the Far East, they needed to pass the continent of Africa. And the Cape was basically halfway towards the Middle East and the Far East. And they thought to themselves that it would be necessary to somewhere along the route stop somewhere and ensure that they replenish their food, that they replenish their water, that they replenish what they needed at some of, and the Cape at that point was the ideal location for that. So everything started, and the reason why I have these 4 provinces is this is what South Africa looked like initially. When we talk about colonialism and slavery in South Africa, we speak about the two in tandem. We cannot speak about slavery without speaking about colonialism, because colonialism in South Africa was greatly as a result of slavery. Initially, there were many explorers that came from Europe to conquer the new lands. Firstly, there were Portuguese, which came around the continent of Africa, or tried rather to come around the continent of Africa on their way to India, the Far East. There were Dutch seafarers, there were British seafarers, there were even Swedes, Norwegians, and others. And some of the first that came past or came around the coast of Africa were the Portuguese. And we see in 1487, Bartolomeu Dias, he came past the coast of Africa. But when he came near the Cape, there was such severe storms, which basically battered his boats against the rocks, and a number of his boats sank. And he called this the Cape of Storms. But eventually, when he went back, he couldn't further his journey to India. He went back and he told the king what had transpired. The king said, no, you should not call it the Cape of Storms, rather call it the Cape of Good Hope. Because if you did not reach the Cape of Good Hope, you would not have known that you just passed the pinnacle of the African continent, or the halfway of the African continent. Thereafter, in 1497, another explorer, his fellow countryman, Vasco da Gama, ventured on the same route, and he came past he came past Cape Town. He came past the most southernmost tip of Africa, which is the Cape of Good Hope. So they were the first that came. Thereafter, the Dutch and the British followed suit, and they all came past the Cape Colony, or the southernmost point of Africa, which was Cape Point at that time. And they the Dutch decided to establish a station here, a halfway station here at Cape Town, and they called it the Cape Colony. I will interchange the words Cape Town, Cape Colony, and the Western Cape, because that is basically the same denomination that we use for Cape Town, or the Cape Colony at the time. When the Dutch came in 1652, they sent Jan van Riebeeck to the Cape for the purpose of establishing a replenishment station at the Cape Colony. But when he came here at the Cape, there were already indigenous people living here, the Khoi and the San, that have been trading with the Portuguese and have been trading with many other nationalities and seafarers. And they could trade in vegetables, they could trade in livestock, cattle, they could trade in poultry, they could trade in fruit and vegetables. And when they realized that the Dutch were now setting up camp here, they were not very happy, because now they were encroaching on their land, they were encroaching on their farms, and eventually there were skirmishes and eventual warfare between the Khoi and the Dutch. The Dutch call it the frontier wars, but the Khois called it the wars of dispossession. They were taking our land, of which we were not very happy. But even before the Dutch came, in 1510, a certain Portuguese sailor by the name of, I can't remember his name now, but I'll get to it later on. He came across the Khoi. He traded with them, Francisco de Almeida. Francisco de Almeida came in 1510, and he came across and he basically stole some of the livestock, he stole some of the fruit and vegetables, he kidnapped some of the women and children, and the Khoi and the San actually attacked him, and they killed him and 60 of his sailors. So that was not the first time that the Khoi and the Korana, which were some of the indigenous tribes which make up the Garankong-Kaikona tribes, they were not very happy. And they basically, once again, came into warfare with the Dutch. But because the Dutch had the firepower, the Dutch had the cannons, the Dutch had the ships, the Dutch could easily decimate them. And the Khoi had very little, although they fought quite heroically, they did not have the firepower to match the Dutch. And more the Dutch started to encroach onto their land. In so much is that in 1666, the Dutch built a structure at the Cape which was known as the castle or the fort. It was called the fort initially to protect the Dutch against the Khoi's attacks, and eventually today it is called the Cape Castle. And this was under the auspices of the Dutch, and by extension, the Dutch East India Company, or the VOIC. When the British later realized the benefits of having a halfway station at the Cape, they naturally challenged the authority of the Dutch. And the Dutch were not easily going to relent. And the Dutch decided to basically resist, which led to some wars, but two major wars which took place between the Dutch and the British. The one war was the Battle of Muizenberg in 1795, and the other one was the Battle of Blouberg in 1806, which was also known as the Battle of Cape Town. These two battles basically left a legacy in South Africa, where South Africa and Cape Town initially, that's why Cape Town was basically called the mother city, because it's the mother city of the country. It's the mother city of Africa, of the South African population. And the mother city basically has known the authority of two colonial powers. First the Dutch, and later on the British. That's why there is a lot of history in Cape Town, specifically in relation. There's a lot of heritage in relation to the Dutch and the British in the province of Cape Town or the Cape Colony. People speak Dutch in Cape Town or form a dialect of Dutch. People have different cuisine that it comes from Dutch. There are architecture that are derived from Dutch. And there's also a lot of English heritage. There are a lot of names which are from Dutch and English. There are basically towns and cities named after English generals and so forth. So these two colonial powers had a massive influence on South Africa's heritage, on South Africa's history. Here is a depiction of the fort or the castle as it is in Cape Town and what it looks like. And if one has the opportunity to visit Cape Town, a visit to the fort would necessarily be of great interest. Now you can understand when slaves were actually brought to Cape Town, they were first held at the castle. Slaves were brought from Guinea. Slaves were brought from India. Slaves were brought from Malacca. Slaves were eventually brought from Indonesia, Java, and later on Malaysia. And these basically led to the colonialists using the slave people to work on their farms. Okay, I've already touched on the reasons for annexing the Cape as a colony, because the wars between the two colonial powers had the result that the Cape Colony was first under the control, as I mentioned, of the Dutch and also afterwards the British. And this was during the 18th and early 19th century. When diamonds was discovered much later, as a lot of the Dutch trekked into the hinterland of South Africa, they came into the northern part of the country, and they came into a town called Kimberley where diamonds was discovered, and much later gold was discovered. This in itself is another chapter in South Africa history, and which further embedded colonialism in this country. And obviously, I won't dwell into that. Okay, because the settlers at the Cape Colony were few, they couldn't do all the work, and the indigenous population was very weary of them. The indigenous population, the Khoi, the San, the Korana, they were fighting with the Dutch, and they would necessarily not want to work for the Dutch because they saw these settlers or colonials as imposters who stole from them, and therefore necessitated the colonials to source a workforce outside the boundaries of the Cape and the country. And the first slaves were brought to Cape Town, or the Cape Colony at the time, in 1658 by the Amersfoort and the Hassel. These were two boats that brought the first slaves, which were kept at the castle or at the fort. As I mentioned, the slaves were brought from Guinea and Angola. The majority came from Madagascar, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. And during the periods of 1659 to 1661, up to 10,000 slaves came from Ceylon, Batavia, Malacca, and thereafter in 1660 from Indonesia and Malaysia. And one can imagine bringing slaves on such a long journey and keeping them in the hull of the boats with little water, food being rationed. Many did not complete the journey. Many that died on the boats were just thrown overboard, and they were eaten by the sharks along the road. And this is more or less a depiction of what it looked like, how slaves were treated on those boats and the journey that they made along the route. Slaves were initially kept at the castle of Gudo, as I've iterated, but as their numbers increased, they were later moved to a building called the slave quarter. The slave quarter is now renamed, it is in Cape Town. It is situated next to the Houses of Parliament in Cape Town. It is now renamed the Slave Lodge. And if you once again have an opportunity to visit Cape Town, do take an excursion to the Slave Lodge. There you will hear the cries. There you will see the putrid and debasing conditions under which the slaves lived. Because men, women, and children were housed in barrack-style buildings that looked like stables. There were no windows. I will depict a picture of what it looked like, but that is in later years when there were windows put into the building. And because a lot of these sailors and colonialists did not have their wives or their families with them, they had free reign to enter as they pleased the slave lodge and the slave quarter, and could fraternize with the female slaves. The men were dehumanized by allowing them to wear swords and a pair of sandals or barefoot, and the women needed to wear a scarf. These were all regulatory methods to control the slaves. I do not think any one of us would be able to understand the conditions which these people called slaves lived under. Here is a depiction of tunnels. Here is a depiction of some of the cold, damp conditions under which they had to live. And when that door closed, there was very little ventilation. There were no windows to open. There were no air conditioning. And they had, after a long day's work, which could sometimes mean up to 12 hours until daylight is being expunged, they had to come to these kind of conditions. Here is the slave quarter in Cape Town. And if you can look on the left side, you will see there are some windows or just some holes made into the walls. And this is what their conditions look like. Previously, the walls were closed. There was just a door for them to enter. Many were kept in chains. And if any slave had dared to wander or to run off, he had a bounty on his head. He could be killed. If any slave that worked on a farm had wandered off or had ran off, the farmer or those who caught him could cut off his feet or cut his hands as a demonstration to other slaves on what would happen to them if they ever had an inkling or a thought of escaping or running off from their master. At some point, as I mentioned, the slave population outnumbered the colonialists. Slaves worked on the farms, as I said. And in 1807, the British Empire decided to abandon slavery. But slavery still continued up until 1834 in South Africa at the Cape Colony and surrounds. And by this time, as you can see, we earlier talked about the establishment of the fort in 1666. It is now more than 150 years later, where many of the colonialists and the settlers at the time, the sailors, had intermingled with the slave population and the Cape. And this became a factor in the rise of a mixed race, what today is being regarded as a colored population. I will later on look where the term colored comes from and how it was basically utilized by one of the later governments. A very oppressive and discriminatory government used this mixed race as a term they denoted as colored. Here's a depiction of how slaves were auctioned. Slaves were auctioned like cattle. They were auctioned like commodities. They could be sold. And advertisements of them being sold were widely publicized. In Cape Town today, we have the same podium as a reminder in the CBD of Cape Town of what this looked like for people that were regarded as slaves. And in my book, I narrate the debilitating effect of slavery as follows. How can there be any justification where people were hunted like animals, incarcerated in chains and carted away from their place of birth by force, traded like commodities, coerced into labor, their bodies broken, their hopes and dreams vanquished, their human spirit diminished, and their souls obliterated? There are times in history when those who wield power lose all semblance of their common humanity, and slavery was such a time. Slavery and colonialism goes hand in hand in South Africa, and this is just an overview of what it did to the spirit and the trauma that is still part of South Africa's legacy from colonialism and slavery. I will go now on to the second part of the South African history as depicted in the book, that colonialism were not only going to be accepted by many people that already were here in South Africa. And the notion is always that with the coming of the colonialists, South Africa was discovered, but South Africa was not discovered. There were people that already lived here prior to 1478 and prior to 1652, when the settlers set foot on this country or on this land. One of the great leaders that lived here of the Gorinkai corner was somebody by the name of Outsumato, or Harry. They used to call him Harry. He was the chief of the Gorinkai corner. He was a very intelligent person, and he was one of the people that first had warfare in the wars of dispossession against the colonialists. There was also a lady by the name of Krutua, who was Eva van Meerhof, and you will see van Meerhof is a Dutch surname. She married a colonial settler, and from Krutua and her husband also came part of the mixed race. Then there are also some of the political exiles, some of the freedom fighters from the Far East that fought against Dutch occupation in their homelands. And one of them was a prince from Makassar. His name was Abadin Datia Jusuf, or as he is commonly called, Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar. Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar came in 1690, and together with 47 of his followers. He was basically stationed at, he was first caught by the Dutch after they duped him. They fought heroically against the Dutch in Indonesia, and they couldn't catch him after many attempts. They eventually told him that he will be given clemency if he hands himself in. And when he did hand himself over to the authorities, he was basically taken into custody. He was shipped off to Ceylon. But they were worried. If he's going to Ceylon, he might still escape, as he did many times and arouse the population in Indonesia again. So they brought him to Madagascar, but they were still worried he might just get onto a ship and go back to Indonesia or Java at the time. And eventually they brought him to Cape Town. He was a nobleman. He was a great leader. He was a literate. And even the governor at the time came to receive him when he landed here with 47 of his followers. And he was held at the fort in Cape Town, but eventually they became afraid of him, and they realized the influence of this man could basically arouse the slaves and eventually overthrow the authority at the Cape. And then they took him 50 kilometers outside of Cape Town into a desolate space called Makassar, or a farm rather, Zandvliet, which later on became also took the name of Makassar. This was one of the great leaders. He was only in South Africa for 5 to 6 years when he passed on, but his legacy is still being felt today, and he is commonly regarded as the father of Islam in South Africa, because he was the first person of the Muslim faith that set foot in South Africa or at the Cape. Another notable leader who was also a political exile was Imam Abdullah ibn Kadu Abdul Salam, who was also commonly known as Tuan Guru. Tuan Guru was also of nobility. He was also an intellectual, and he was kept at the very famous Robben Island. He was one of the first prisoners, even long before Nelson Mandela and other ANC leaders were held at Robben Island. He was held there for a number of years, and we will see later on the time that he was kept at it. Tuan Guru was so he was such an intellectual that he could write the Quran out of his head. He wrote 2 Qurans out of memory, because at the time the Quran was banished at the Cape, and the followers of Islam or Muslims, they could not have any Qurans in their possession. This was in 1803, 1804. This is a picture depicting Sheikh Yusuf teaching to some of his followers, and this is the karamat, or the shrine, that has been built to him where he lived on the farm Zandvliet, now known as the Kramat, near the town of Makassar. South Africa's origins are multiple. South Africans' origins are from various different influences. We have the original indigenous people, the Khoi, the Korana, the San, the Garinkaikona. The origins of South Africa comes from the colonists, which are the Dutch, the British, the Swedes, the Norwegians, who all touch here, the Portuguese. There are so many colonists and settlers that settled here in South Africa. Then it's the slaves, many who came from Bengal, India, Java, Sumatra, the east coast of Africa, Tanzania, Madagascar, etc. It is also the origins that comes from the noblemen and the political exiles that hailed from Batavia, Java, Indonesia, Sumatra, etc. It is also the origins of the Indian traders, many were merchant class, and indigent laborers who came in the 1860s up to the 1880s to work on the east coast on the sugar plantations. And it was also the origins of the African tribes of Africa, which makes up the people of South Africa. There are some pictures of some on my left. We have the San. We were hunter and gatherers, the original people of South Africa, the indigenous people. Mandela, as you can see, has got a great likeness to many of them. His facial features basically is reminiscent of theirs. And on the right are a number of young persons which are called colored. And as you can see, the origins, some of them have green eyes, light of complexion, and these basically make up what we call today the colored people. I will later on expand on that. But the next phase of South Africa's history that I want to touch on is 1948. 1948 is a watershed time in the history of South Africa, because that was the time when the white Afrikaner nationalists, and who are the Afrikaners? The Afrikaners are the origins of the Dutch settlers or colonialists, who perceive themselves as a superior race. And they formed what was called the National Party. They won the elections in 1948. And the system of government which they basically adopted was based on the Nazism, Aryan policy of racial superiority, where they regarded the white race as the supreme race. This completely, after 48, changed the whole dynamic of South Africa's history. And the architect of apartheid was a person known as Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd. Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd was a renowned arch racist, and he basically guided the policy of apartheid together with a number of his cohorts into what was eventually the blueprint for South Africa's 40-year rule, 45-year rule under apartheid. But Verwoerd was eventually assassinated in 1966 by somebody by the name of Demetrios Savenda, who was a person of mixed race. Demetrios Savenda had a lot of racism against him because his father was a Swiss man and his mother was a Xhosa woman, which eventually led him to not being accepted in either race. And we will see how this played out. The Nationalist Party government, when they came to power, immediately adopted, you can see they came into power in 1948. They immediately adopted a number of racial classifications and racial laws, which basically influenced the whole population. Although the white population was the minority, they controlled the levels of power, they controlled the army, and they controlled basically all state institutions. The first thing, or the first act that was enacted, was the Population Registration Act. And I've noted a number of acts that will play out under the rule of the apartheid regime or the National Party. Another one was the Group Areas Act. I will entertain that one separately. The Mixed Marriages Act, the Immorality Act, and the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act, the Job Reservation Act. These were just some of the acts which the National Party enacted and ensured that it is being used to control the South African population. I'm going to go into each one of these acts shortly, but just briefly, just to give you a sense how this basically controlled the different races in South Africa under apartheid. This is what the Population Registration Act depicted. It depicted and it divided the population into different categories, with the white population or the white race group right at the top. The Cape Coloured, the Malay, the people that came from slave and political exile history, the indigenous Griqua, people that came from China, people that came from the Indian subcontinent, and other Asians which were basically called probably from Japan, Korea, and then there were other colors. These were the different race groups. And in the identity documents, it basically had certain codes, it had certain numbers, which basically ensured that people, even if they did not see you, they could just look at the numbers and know what race you were. So you can see how this played itself out. If you wanted to attend and you applied maybe university, they would immediately know that you did not qualify because of the code that was in your identity book on the right. This is how the different population groups were divided or distinguished in South Africa. Then we go to the Group Areas Act. This is my hometown, the Strand. Small fishing village where people lived from the sea, owned their own boats. My grandfather, some of his friends, some of his neighbors, they had their own boats. They had their own crews, and they lived from the sea. And they could frequent the sea. They could, these were the simple houses which they lived in. It was a very contented, a very harmonious community. And when the Group Areas Act came, the Group Areas Act decided, or legislated rather, that this area in the CBD, in the middle of town, was going to be declared a white area now. And our people had to remove themselves forthwith. And if they did not remove themselves, they will be removed by the government. The government showed no mercy. They ripped out the heart of the community as follows. This legacy of the group areas left the following, and in my apartheid diary, I narrate it as follows. From the tight-knit communities who lived in total harmony across religious, social, and economic boundaries, our communities disintegrated into non-cohesive entities that had to focus entirely on the individual survival. The loss, the demise, and the complete disintegration of the social cohesion and interpersonal community spirit were possibly some of the most severe consequences which the Group Areas Act brought with it. I have lived through the Group Areas Act, and I can attest as a lived experience that it has left a legacy, it has left the pain, it has left hurt that cannot be, it has left memories that cannot be easily erased. Oh, this is what transpired. This is what happened to our houses. Those houses which I showed you, these houses, we had to vacate, we had to remove ourselves, and we did not remove ourselves, the bulldozers came. There's the mosque, which my great-great-grandfather built in 1794, was left standing alone. All the houses around there were completely decimated. They were completely bulldozed. And we were dumped into townships or barrack-style townships, as you can see right in the right-hand corner. Dusty roads, where we had tarred roads, where we had facilities, electricity, as you can see the electricity, we did not have any of that. So they ripped the heart out of the community, and it basically left a lasting hurt and pain. And as I depict it again in my book, that it dawns on one that that life is forever lost, except for the memories and what caused such unnecessary turmoil for a people, for the sole reason that the skin color was of a darker hue. Just because we had a slightly darker color of skin, we were discriminated against. It brings a lump to the throat, tears to the eyes, and a yearning heart when you realize what a terrible and inhumane time that was that we lived and experienced. And it is something that will go with us to the grave and not be easily forgotten. The next act was the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act. It might sound laughable, it might sound comical, it might sound jocular, but all facilities were basically segregated. The best facilities for whites, and the least facilities or the worst facilities for non-whites. From cinemas to buses to clinics to residential areas to schools to universities to hospitals to graveyards. From the day you were born, you will be told where you will be born in a hospital, which hospital, where you will die eventually, right through your life, which cemetery you will be buried. For everything under apartheid was separate, with the best for the whites and the least or the worst rather for the non-whites. And here are some depictions of that. Even beaches were segregated, where you can see everything, beach and sea, whites only, and the others were for other races. And there are so many stories that one can tell you where people drown because of the beaches which they frequent, which were not conducive for swimming. But unfortunately, they used it, and because there's no other facilities for them. Many heartbreaking stories in that respect. The Immorality Act and the Mixed Marriages Act. The apartheid government had these two acts which told us who we can marry, who we can cohabit, who we can date, and who we can engage to. Because these two acts, the Immorality Act said that sex across the color line between white people and other races were prohibited. Initially, it was just prohibited between a black and a white person, but when the apartheid government or the National Party came to power in 1950, it was completely changed. And anyone that were caught in transgression of this law would be locked up and have a criminal record. And if you pass immorality, if you manage to evade immorality, you could not marry, because the Mixed Marriages Act said it prohibited marriages between whites and non-whites. And this was one of the first acts that was passed by the National Party in 1948. Many people who actually were married before 1948, who were regarded as mixed couples, were hounded. Many were harassed. Many were criminalized, or they were transgressing the law, and many left the country. And I'm going to relate one story to you, a personal story which I had the privilege and the courtesy of interviewing one person who was caught up in such a marriage and in such an Immorality Act. It was a heart-rending story, and I still sometimes get quite emotional when I narrate it. This was the story of Jumi and Khalil. Jumi was a colored woman who was a Muslim, and Karl Frederick Gerardus de Roofen, who later became Khalil, was a white Afrikaner and a staunch Christian. They grew up together, did not live far from each other, that's just 2 streets away. And when apartheid arrived, they were already boyfriend and girlfriend. And this story led to them not being fazed, frightened by legislation. Legislation could not keep these two lovers apart. But if you read the story, if you listen to the story as depicted in the book, it is one of immense trauma. It is one of heartache, but it's one also of deep held love for each other. Because this is a story that can be regarded as an ode to love. And as I depicted in the book, it's a testimony to true love beyond race, color, religion, and creed. And Gerardus was hounded by the police. Gerardus was ostracized by his own family. Gerardus was ostracized at work when word spread that he was married to a colored woman. Gerhardus was eventually an outsider and outcast by his own white race group. Jumi was hounded by the police. She was incarcerated on many occasions. Eventually, they left sometimes the little town where we used to live in the Strand to trek 50 or 70 kilometers away, where people did not know them. And when they went into a restaurant, they were asked to be served, and they heard her speak. They would say, but this is not. She was light of complexion. She had green eyes. And when they heard her speak, they said, but this is not a white woman. They would ask them to leave, or they would refuse to serve them. They eventually married under Muslim law, and they had 3 children, Sharif, Ikram, and Ruwaida. Ruwaida the oldest, Ikram the second, and Sharif the youngest. And if you look at them, they are light of complexion, but the trauma, the hurt, the pain that these young people felt in their childhood is also a very traumatic, heart-rending, and emotional story, because they never knew their dad. He was an outcast. He couldn't be with them as a father to a family. He only came at night when it was dark. He would slip in and early morning slip out again. And if the police was on his track, he would not come. And as Ikram related to me in his story, saying that I only saw this man. I never knew him to be my father. He was a stranger to me. And eventually, when the dawn of the new South Africa came in 1994, it was the first time that they could live as a family. And Ikram and Ruwaida and Sharif were already adults, all married. Khalil passed on in 2008, and he had a family life only of a few years, because at the time when the new South Africa came, he was already very sickly. This is the family, Khalil and Jumi on the left, and Khalil with his children on the right. A very traumatic story, very emotional story for me too. So this was what the National Party did from 1948. So what happened next? The oppressed people started to organize themselves into a more unified force through the non-parliamentary organization. We must understand that the current government, ANC, under Nelson Mandela at the time and Chief Albert Luthuli, were banned. They were not allowed in South Africa. Just as much as many other liberation organizations like the Pan-African Congress under Robert Mangalisu Sobukwe also were banned. The Transvaal Indian Congress, the African People's Organization, the Natal Indian Congress, the Azanian People's Organization, the Black People's Convention, all of these bodies were banned by the apartheid government because they saw them as a threat to their rule. But even before these organizations came into being, we had many political freedom fighters, as I mentioned earlier. Altsomatu was one who was incarcerated at Robben Island. And as I said earlier, Tuangburu was also incarcerated from 1780 to 1793 for his anti-colonial activities. So they were freedom fighters long before the ANC. So the organizations started to challenge the power of the National Party. And they had different streams and political thoughts that came into being. Africa is for the African. Black is beautiful. Our liberation will only come through the barrel of the gun. These are all different political streams. And as I said earlier, in 1510, there were already skirmishes between the colonialists and the settlers. When Francisco de Almeida was killed with 60 of his crew, there was the wars of dispossession. South Africa experienced many wars, but it was in 1960 when the black population, the black African population who needed to wear a pass, an ID book, a card, if they moved around South Africa, and if they were caught in a certain area, they could be locked up for transgressing the pass laws. They rose up, they burned their passes, and in the ensuing melee, in the uprising, in the protest, a number of people were shot as they ran away. They were shot in the back. But the culmination of all of that uprisings was in 1976 and in 1904, when the Soweto uprisings and the school and education uprisings started. It was the youth of the country that basically was the catalyst to the defeat or the demise, eventually, of the apartheid government. The brutal, oppressive, racist discrimination government. The student uprising started in 1976 when the National Party government decreed a policy that Afrikaans will be used in all Black African schools, which was only the third language of Black Africans. The pupils came out in protest and they marched against this policy, but it quickly degenerated into chaos because the authorities was not going to have anything of it, and they violently tried to put it down. And they used live ammunition, killing some of the children. This eventually spread like wildfire, and in the space of a few months, it engulfed the whole country as pupils and communities across the country came out in massive protest actions and marches. This was the culmination of the latent protest or the latent dissatisfaction that has been simmering for many decades and for many centuries. The young people came out in their thousands. The schools when I say the young people, I'm talking about the non-white young people, the Black, African, Indian young people. None of the white schools were influenced by this. It was solely the non-white pupils that came out. And the uprisings went right through up until the 1980s as schools and universities had what we call protest actions and rolling mass actions. It was a daily phenomenon. And as the children were being beaten, tear gassed, and shot, and this is also a lived experience, the community started organizing. The churches came out, the mosques came out, civic organizations came out, and they all joined the protest. And the apartheid government was at a complete loss on how to quell the uprisings. And they only used brute force. And in the process, killing hundreds and thousands of protesters. Many were incarcerated. Many were assassinated. Some were banned. And some were detained without trial. You could have been detained without your family knowing for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, even 120 days. And the apartheid government was at a loss. And they called out many state of emergencies. And in 1983, the disparate groups came together in Rocklands in Cape Town, and they established one body, a broad-based civic movement which included religious, sport, social, political formations, and it was called the United Democratic Movement, or the UDF. The UDF, this body, was the internal mass movement which basically brought the apartheid government to its knees, with its rolling mass action, with its non-violent protest actions. But what did the apartheid government do when the children came out and the protest started and the communities joined? They responded viciously and violently, repressing or trying to repress the protest and the actions. And what did the children do, or the students and the learners and the communities? They revolted against the state. They started to become more violent as well, to match the authorities. Those that were basically in cahoots with government were hounded as well. They were taken out of the communities and they had to flee for their lives as well. I need to stand still at the UDF. As I said, was a broad-based political, social, community, civic-based organization which kept the pressure on the National Party government and was the single most important movement in the absence of the banned ANC, PAC, AZAPO, and all other formations. And the UDF was the catalyst that ensured the internal struggle within the country was kept, the momentum was kept. Obviously, the leadership of this movement was also hounded, banned, incarcerated, tortured, and held without trial, and some were assassinated. But they did not let up or relent. And I can say that the pressure which the UDF brought to bear on the apartheid government was one of the single most important factors which helped to erode the power of the apartheid government, because then the outside world started to become more concerned as the National Party was starting to lose their grip on power. And many of the countries outside that had interest here in the country, in our resources, in our minerals, they started to become worried. And they put pressure through sanctions on the apartheid government to change course. This is the UDF, and one of the leaders of the UDF on the right, Reverend Ellen Aubrey Busak. These were some of the clergy that took a stance and at the front of the struggle for justice and equality in South Africa, all part of the UDF mass democratic movement. There's some notable figures there. Once again, Dr. Ellen Aubrey Busak, Sheikh Nazim Mohammed, Sheikh Habir on the right. These were all people that took the lead in ensuring that justice and equality in South Africa becomes a reality. Some of the young freedom fighters, or young lions as they were called, on the left is Ashley Kriel, and on the right, Anton Franz. Both fought valiantly against the apartheid government. They were cornered. They were eventually killed and murdered. Young men in the prime of their life, many of them were taken out. The fall of apartheid. The apartheid government could not stem the tide of pressure inside the country. And as I said, the international community realized that the hold on power was fast slipping out of the hands of the South African National Party apartheid government. And contact was started by some opposition politicians and business leaders inside South Africa, or South Africans, with the banned ANC, PAC in the late 1980s. In Dakar, Senegal, as well as in Lusaka, Zambia. And the initial talks, exploratory talks, turned to negotiations. And with the pressure continuing inside the country, it eventually forced the National Party government to enter into agreements with the ANC and others. And in 1990 and 1991, The band leaders such as Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, as well as the organization mentioned previously, were all unbanned. From 1990-91, developments within the country moved at breakneck speed. And before we knew it, South Africa had its first democratic elections in 1994. Apartheid fell. That is the old South African flag on the left, as part of the colonies on the left of the British, and on the right, the small flags of the Dutch, and on the right, the new South African flag. And in the book, I narrate apartheid as follows. The apartheid system, for those like us who experience the pain, has left its brutal legacy. And while it is better to forgive those who were the perpetrators of such deeds against their fellow citizens, they should not be easily forgotten. The wounds still run deep. The scars have not completely healed. The residue of apartheid legacy is still very evident, and the pain tangible. This is what apartheid did to us. And today, this is a map of the new South Africa, where we have 4 provinces, like I depicted initial graph. Here is the new South Africa, with the province, the Western Cape, which started off as the Cape Colony, with the mother city, Cape Town, right in the corner on the left side. We now have 9 other provinces. KwaZulu-Natal remained. It used to be called Natal. Free State remained, but the Cape has also now received the Northern Cape and the Eastern Cape, where it was just a Cape Colony. And Gauteng has now evolved and part of Free State, where Gauteng has evolved from Transvaal. The 4 initial provinces was the Cape Colony, the Free State, Natal, and Transvaal. Part of KwaZulu-Natal was taken into Mpumalanga. Part of Transvaal was taken into Mpumalanga, Limpopo, Northwest, and part of Free State were taken in by the Northern Cape, Northwest, and the Eastern Cape. This is what South Africa looks like at present. And this is the book that I have actually narrated today. I hope I have been focused. I have been able to convey what has been requested of me. I hope that I have vindicated your confidence that you have instilled in me to narrate a historical narrative and part lived experience which we experience in South Africa. And if you ever have the opportunity, 90 to 95% of the information which I have related is in the book. But to basically expand on some of the areas, I have drawn from other sources as well. I take this opportunity once again of thanking you, and I hope that I have done justice to your confidence. Thank you so much. I don't know if there are questions and if I am allowed to entertain questions. Khalid? If there are questions, I would gladly entertain some of the questions and I hope that I can answer them. But if not, then from my side, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have been sharing this information with yourselves and for the invitation extended to me. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have been part of your company. I'm overawed by by your support and by your gratitude. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Hello. The participants, you can go for your respective venue for your paper presentation. Offline paper presenters, you can go for your respective venue. Just to take 5 minutes for the paper presentations. Okay, your presentation will be followed by few questions by the chairperson.